I've always found it really interesting that when guests walk into a restaurant, they want to be treated like they're your best friend. They want to be treated like they basically bought the place, that they own everyone, and they're the big celebrity that we all hope to see, especially when they know the owner. But in return, they don't even want to deliver a basic level of human respect. I've always found it interesting that in order to work in hospitality, you have to be literally the most emotionally intelligent human being to be able to make people's day better and brighter, anticipate their needs, and send them on their way. And at best, you're getting minimum wage plus tips. And while we all know someone who makes more money than we would expect in hospitality, it's generally speaking not a wealth building tool unless you are a serial restaurateur, something that is notoriously difficult to do. So where does all that energy and entitlement really come from? In order to understand that, you'd have to zoom into American culture, and you'd have to zoom all the way back to slavery. Once again, everything can be traced back to slavery in America. After the Civil War, restaurant owners, and most businesses for that matter, they didn't want to pay their employees. But in the hospitality industry, they found a loophole that they could supplement wages with the extra cash that the guests would have on hand. That was how tip culture was birthed. So now, we're even more motivated to provide not just excellent service, but to bring the vibes, to make you feel like we're really happy to see you, to make you feel like you're our best friend. And that expectation has only since doubled down and evolved since those times. Now the expectation in America is that you leave a minimum of 20% tip. But a lot of people would say, if the service wasn't good, I'm not tipping 20%. I say tipping culture really needs to be reevaluated. When you look at other cultures, for example, Jamaicans. I'm a Jamaican and I see this all the time. You go into a Jamaican restaurant, they're not going to greet you with a smile. They're not going to have this warm welcome for you. And they're not going to act like you did them a favor by walking into their restaurant. They know they're doing you a favor by bringing authentic jerk chicken, oxtail, curry goat, you're lucky if they have ackee and saltfish. And they have this very straightforward dynamic. A great Jamaican restaurant will have food on hand and not be out of anything. And they'll just kind of keep it transactional and keep it simple. While that's a counter service experience, typically, this idea that you should have your ass kissed in restaurants, honestly, is a little much. Because when you look at any other industry, any other business, you have to reciprocate that level of respect. Look at the medical industry. I mean, how many of us have a story of a doctor that we had an appointment with and they showed up when they were ready? They showed up when they had time. You had to be prepared for that appointment. Otherwise, they would send you on their way. I find it really interesting that in hospitality, it's really the only industry where the customer is not only allowed to be wrong, but presumed to always be right. I find that really interesting. So when you look back on the history of tipping culture and the fact that we were expected to be paid with the leftover cash of the guests, and how that translates to the power dynamic and the psychology of hospitality guests now, whether it's a restaurant, a hotel, a bar, it's really interesting how these power dynamics manifest in service-based jobs. I always found it perplexing that despite the fact that you have to be an extremely skilled person to work in a restaurant and to have success at it, an extremely skilled person to anticipate the needs of all of your guests, to anticipate their emotions, and to reflect back to them positivity despite the energy that they're giving you, it's honestly psychological warfare. And that's why I'm a big believer that in order to have great service, you also need to be a good person. You also need to be respectful and be accountable. If you made a mistake and ordered the wrong thing, own that. If you don't remember what happened, but you know you want a different result, own that. This idea that If you don't give me everything that I want, I'm going to write a bad review. I'm going to email your boss. And many people go as far as gunning for your job. That, to me, is ridiculous behavior, and very much so inherited from those early practices when labor wasn't expected to be paid for. To this day, when you look at different states on their minimum wage, tipped employees are not expected to make minimum wage. In states like Georgia and Louisiana, tipped employees only get $2.13 per hour because the expectation is that they'll make up to minimum wage with their tips. In states like California and New York, it's a little bit higher. California minimum wage is closer to $17 an hour and for tipped employees. And in New York, it's closer to $11 an hour. And then there's an extra $5 of like subsidiary tip, which I don't even understand how that works. But the point is that for the most part, being a bartender and being a server is still a minimum wage job. And while we all know that bartender that makes bank, for the most part, I've never heard of somebody waiting tables and building wealth. And there's a reason for that. And while you could say, oh, it's an entry-level job, it's really not. If you've never worked in a restaurant before, it's really hard to get a job in a restaurant. Many of them expect you to be extremely experienced. Many of them expect you to have the knowledge of a sommelier or a cicerone. Many of them expect you to understand coffee and understand where things come from and know what's going on in the local ecosystem. I've even had a restaurant job that wouldn't hire you unless you could list out 4 local farms in the state. How is that an entry-level job? How is it an entry-level job to present yourself a certain way, to have a fundamental, foundational knowledge base, to be educated, and to be able to read people and get them the things that they need? Right? I can't go into a restaurant and not find a college-educated employee there. And while the industry is notoriously difficult to make a profit off of, I think we can all agree that people who work in restaurants as hosts, as bartenders, as servers, as managers, they're highly skilled people. And frankly, they deserve a freaking raise. And if we can't reimagine hospitality in a way that creates this equitable, in a way that creates this reciprocal dynamic between the guests and the employees, it's always going to be a churn and burn industry with high turnover, and that's only going to affect the guests. And isn't that the number one concern, is making sure the guests are having a great experience? So some restaurants have opted out of tips. They just charge a little bit more and decide to pay people hourly. Only a few restaurants have done that. I've heard of a few restaurants in San Francisco. There's 1 or 2 restaurants in LA that are doing that. You'll always find 1, maybe 2 in major food cities that are adopting these things, but it honestly needs to be worldwide. It honestly needs to be something that is completely normalized, because this weird power dynamic that shows up when people walk through the door, it needs to be more reciprocal, because hospitality in any other case goes both ways.